Blooming weeds. All right. Okay, I think we're ready. So it's good to be back in Citrus today. If you're watching on the camera this morning, we're back home and you should be able to hear us a lot better this week. And we apologize about the last couple weeks, but we had an election in this building and it was serviced, and you can actually look down at the floor and you see yourself looking back. The floor is so shiny here. But we do welcome you back to continue our Bible study. We have left the book of Judges, and today we're visiting the book of Ruth. And getting near the end of our study, there are new Bible study books here for those who follow along to our study in the morning. So today we're talking about faithfulness, session 12, and page 109. Last week we talked about compromise, and we were in Judges 16 towards the end of the book, and it was the story about Samson. And most of us had read the story of Samson when we were kids. He's the big, strong guy that pulled the pillars and the building came down. But we really studied him in detail last week, and we found that compromise was the main issue that his life was ended the way that it did. He was weakened and taken out by the enemy and perished in that state. So compromise is a serious thing to the life of a Christian. If we compromise our values, it can lead to destruction. So we talked about Samson's physical strength. We all know that our physical strength cannot save us. We can be the strongest person in the world like he was at the time, and it did nothing to help him in his spiritual walk. So he let the enemy compromise his values, and his strength had left him. And what was the big thing? What was the big story about? What gave him his strength? His hair, right? He had very long hair. We know that he was a Nazarite, and Nazarites were not allowed to cut their hair or drink alcohol or eat anything from a fruit vine. So he was kind of restricted in what he could and couldn't do. But was it really his hair that made him strong? What was the underlying factor? Being faithful and committed to God. That was his underlying strength that it was all about. So Samson was defeated. If we look back to page 106, there was a great question on that page. What do you think Samson's greatest loss was, and why? Was it his capture? Was it his humiliation? Was it his own death, dignity, or freedom? What was his greatest loss out of one of those? What would you say? His greatest loss would be his strength. That's a thing that in our profound weakness, we become strong through God. He picks up where we cannot reach, and he gives us our strength no matter what situation we face. And so the greatest loss of Samson was the Lord had he took his spirit away from Samson, and his strength had simply left him. It wasn't about the hair, because after his hair was shaved, when he was milling in the grind mill, his hair started to grow back. And so In the very end, it was long enough to bring that strength back to him. And the Lord, he prayed to God in that ending scene, and his strength returned. But it was really not about the hair, it was his strength in the Lord. So interesting. The Philistines were indeed destroyed. He called upon God one last time. He was blinded. His eyes had been gouged out, very weakened state, and he couldn't even see the enemy that he took out. But he said that the day that that temple fell in on the people, he killed the greatest number of people that he ever had during battle in his prior years. So an impactful story for us. Many treat it like a childhood fable, but it's a very moral story about our compromise and morals in our life and being faithful and honest to God. So that leads us up to our topic today, faithfulness. And in the midst of Naomi's tragedy, we'll get to know Naomi today. In the midst of her worst time in her lifetime, God demonstrated his care and sovereignty. How many of you know about the book of Ruth? Have you read? Okay. So you're familiar kind of with the story. It's one of my favorite books, actually. And I really get a lot of strength out of this book. We'll be in the first chapter and some of the second chapter. There's a caption here. In his book, A Grieve Observed, C.S. Lewis had written this statement. No one ever told me that grief felt so like fear. I am not afraid, but the sensation is like being afraid. People who face tragedy both feel grief and fear. Many of you know that you saw the scenes of the fire down in Wesley Chapel just last Thursday. Many fire companies were down on scene, and I had gone down to work rehab too. There was 400 firefighters running around and sheriff's deputies, and my job was to keep them fed and hydrated. A lot of them had to get IVs for electrolytes, and so that's what we do at rehab. But a lot of people, the crowd that was there, the residents, there's like 300 people, residents, kids, pets, little children, running around who were both grieved and fearful where they would spend the night. So people who face that, do they remember that God is at work in a scene like that? Sometimes we don't think about things like that. No one had perished in that fire, and all the animals had been rescued out of the building. So that was God at work. It was a reset for a lot of people. But definitely God was present on the ground feeding, and I handed out cookies to a lot of kids and water bottles and things like that, but the kindness and love and compassion for people had come out, and firefighters are one of the most compassionate groups of people I've ever met. So that was a great experience and a great story of how it fits here today. So when grief and fear cloud our path, nothing seems to comfort our heart and give us courage to take into the unknown. A lot of folks wondering even today, without a home, where are they going to be? But it's knowing God, that he cares for us and controls every moment in our life. When we rest our default faith on that principle, that can take you right through any situation. If you believe that God cares for you, that's huge, because many of us have low self-esteem. We don't put ourselves at a high regard, but God created us exactly the way we are and has compassion for every creature that he creates. So knowing that is a bedrock principle of our life. And great question here. How might faith in God's care and control help a person navigate grief and fear? 3 key words I want you to circle in this sentence: faith, help, and fear. How might faith in God's care and control help a person navigate through grief and fear? Using those 3 words, what would your answer be? She is. That's right. Right. That's right. That's right. So our level of faith, when something happens, it automatically shows where we are on that faith scale. And so your level of faith is important. What you believe about God, what you believe about Christ. Who is he? Why did he come? And why should it matter to us? But our level of faith tells us exactly where we're going to find help. If we believe that God will take care of us, it's not an issue. There's bad times, of course, but God is there. He's present. Absolutely. And so our level of faith will tell us where our help is and how we handle fear. Those are the three key words in that sentence. So we're going to come back to that formula several times. And that formula right there is really echoed through the life of Naomi and Ruth. So as we open up the next page, Ruth chapter 1 through chapter 2, the 23rd verse, the book of Ruth comes right toward the end of the judges' rule of Israel and just before Israel's reign of the kings. So we're kind of in a between period. And to this point, Israel had been a conquering people. They were strong. They had seen many battles. The Lord brought them through very dire circumstances and continued to take care of a very obstinate people. Joshua exhibited great faith as he led the people into the promised land and by conquering Jericho. Jericho was a very big fortified city. That was where the walls fell one day of a few faithful men that were there. And so Jericho has always taken a prominent role throughout our biblical history. It always takes the going through Jericho to get to the Holy Land. That's kind of the idea. But God displayed the beauty of his faithfulness through people like Rahab. We remember her back in Joshua 2. And through Israel's obedience to march around the walls of Jericho. They blew their trumpets, and later Caleb demonstrated the Lord's sovereignty by asking Joshua to give him the land that he promised. So when Joshua and Caleb were young, they were both promised pieces of the Holy Land. Joshua, of course, conquered that first by being the leader of that tribe at the time. But it was due to Caleb much later, as he was a lot younger than Caleb or Joshua. So, but his time came due, and he was given what was his. So Caleb had demonstrated his trust in the Lord's sovereignty by asking Joshua to give him the land that the Lord promised him many years before. So in each story, it's important to see that God's people rose to the honor of the Lord to honor the Lord for his providential care. Do we honor the Lord for what he's given us? That's a question we all need to weigh out. So God worked in many mysterious ways through the Old Testament. A lot of it doesn't make sense, but we see that God has our back no matter what. If you think your family is bad and has rough times, just look at some of the families in the Bible that had very significant problems, and yet he blessed them and continued blesses them. So, however, throughout this period in their history, Israel struggled with what? Idolatry and immorality. It was a trip point for them. God ordained judges to rule the people as they proceeded through. Remember the cycle we talked about a couple weeks ago, sin, and then God's judgment. Having the ability to go and confess those sins back to the Lord, and then he delivers us if we confess our sins. So that was a cycle that constantly came through the period of Judges. It was just like a cycle. Israel's leaders, the judges, and the people certainly needed direction, and we need direction today. And the only, really the bit of wisdom that means anything comes from God's bedrock principles. So the book of Ruth reminds any reader that God's providence and faithfulness will not fail no matter how dark the times. As the book opens, the writer introduces a Judean family from Bethlehem to Moab. There's Elimelech, who was the father, and Naomi. They were married. Back in that time and climate, living in around these places, it's a rough life. You had to dig very rocky soil to plant any crops or make a living. You had to go on a journey to find water any place. So back in those days, people did not live like you and I live today. And so they had two sons, and they married Moabite wives. And what does that mean? Moabite wives. Why are they different from Elimelech and Naomi? They're not Jewish. They're not Israelites. So these are people from other tribes, and so that was the intermarrying effect back then. And so they let's see, I just lost my place. Oh, here we go. So this Judean family, Elimelech, Naomi, and their two sons, and they have wives, and their names are Orpah and Ruth. So within 10 years, Elimelech and his two sons died. So Elimelech passes away first, and then a couple years later, Naomi loses both of her sons. So she is an orphan or a widow now, and no means of support because the boys are gone, the husband's gone, and so she's thrown into a very tragic situation. The story is one of tragic loss, deep loyalty, and God's faithfulness to Ruth, who is a foreigner who trusted him. And again, what is Ruth? A Moabite. She's a foreigner to the Israelite people. She's not born into God's family. So as the story unfolds, Ruth decided to remain with her mother-in-law, Naomi, after the loss of her husband. And she followed God into an unknown future and found God faithful through every trial and every hardship. So think about that in our own lives. If our family all passes away and you have your mother-in-law left to go through life, a lot of people, that's a situation for a lot of people. How many of you have good relationships or had good relationships with your mother-in-law? Okay. So, I'm sure the scale is more negative on that than positive, but it proves to us that when it comes right down to the core, we cling to who's closest to us, and that's the moral of this story. So, interesting here. God continued to fulfill his promise of redemption all the way since Genesis 3:15. And we remember back in Genesis, the 3rd chapter, what happened there? After everything was created, going well for a week or two, and then what happened? An apple was picked from a tree, and then sin fell on humanity. So ever since that time, God has had a plan of redemption, and it comes right up through the book of Ruth and continues right on to the era we know it. Mm-hmm. Yes. That's right. That's right. 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 In fact, yeah, evil really didn't exist. It corrupted something good. And so God didn't create evil, but when there was corruption, it showed up. And when that's the same rust on a car, it's not created with a default like that. A tree does not, it's not, many trees have diseases, but it takes something bad to rot out something good. That's the same thing in humanity. So a lot of people say, well, God created evil, and he really didn't, but in the absence of good, there can be evil. So that's interesting that you brought that up. So that's very correct. But we can be assured of God's faithfulness, last sentence, and we can walk confidently into every situation in life. God is not unaware of anything that comes down our path. So how do you see God's care and sovereignty demonstrated? If you were to make a sentence about how you see God's care and sovereignty demonstrated in your life, what would you say? Okay. All right. Anybody else? God's sovereignty and care. Um, it's a tough life out there, living on your own and being independent, and it's tough. But God is the factor in our lives. If we depend on God's care, it goes much better. Yes, right, right. And we have, the God's power within us, you know, and oftentimes it takes bad situations for that to show up. But He is indeed present. So it's not only in our story, but in everyday life that God's sovereignty is all around us. So as we go to our first group of passages here, we pick up in the 11th verse of chapter 1 of Ruth. Ruth has 4 chapters, and it's a very short book, but a very powerful book. I want to summarize verses 1 through 10 before we get to verse 11. So Elimelech moves his family to Moab. Why? Because there's a severe famine upon Israel. And so a man from Bethlehem in Judah left his home to live in the country of Moab. And got an interesting map here from Dad this morning. Let me pass this around. Okay, so we see here Bethlehem is just south of Jerusalem. So it's not on the map, but you see the Star of Jerusalem in blue. And not far from Jerusalem is Bethlehem. So this family walked from Jerusalem, Bethlehem area, to the kingdom of Moab. And Dad was pointing out that between the two are the Dead Sea. And so they had to walk north and through Jericho and down to the kingdom of Moab. So quite a long journey of people that had to travel very long distance. But again, going through Jericho, that's always been a significant factor in our biblical history. So he moves his family. The man's name is Elimelech, and his wife was Naomi. And their 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. And they were Ephraites from Bethlehem in the land of Judah. And when they reached Moab, all that distance, they settled there. One day, Elimelech dies, and Naomi was left with her 2 sons. So they married Moabite women in that country. One married a woman named Orpah, and the other named Ruth. But about 10 years later, both men had passed away and left Naomi alone without her 2 husbands. So, picking up in verse 6, Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had blessed his people again back in their homeland. Back in Jerusalem, things were better, and she caught wind of that. So she probably read the Moab Gazette newspaper and saw that Jerusalem was finally coming back into a civilized land. So they both, Mahlon and Chilion, died. This left Naomi alone, but she heard that things, it says that crops were growing again back home, so the famine was coming to an end. And Naomi and her 2 daughters got ready to leave Moab and return to their homeland. So she starts down the road. They probably got their luggage with them. And the 2 daughters get just out of town. And Naomi protests. She says, "You girls don't want to follow me back home. You have families here. Why not go back to your mother's family, since your husbands are gone, and just start over? Because if you go back to me, with me back to the land of Israel, number one, you're foreigners there. We don't know how you'll be treated, but you don't want to have to spend all that time looking for another husband again." So she really presses them to turn back. One says, okay, that was Orpah. She returned back to the land that she lived. But the other one insisted that she would go with Naomi. That was Ruth. So that's where our story picks up. So it's a chapter, a story about loss, verses 11 through 15. Naomi replied, "Return home, my daughters. Why do you want to go with me? Am I able to have any more sons who could become your husband? Return home, my daughters, for I am too old to have another husband. And even if I thought there was still hope for me to have a husband tonight and to bear sons, you would be willing to wait for them to grow up." So we know the cycle of life takes a while. So she's really encouraging them to turn back. "No, my daughters, my life is too much bitter for you to share because the Lord has turned against me." There's Naomi's default right there. She thinks that God's mad at her. And so that she carries that on her heart. Again, they wept. They all had a moment there in the middle of the road. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And Naomi said, "Look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to their gods." So Moab is nothing like the land of Israel. They don't worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They have different gods. So she says, "Please follow your sister back there. You don't want to go on this journey with me. We don't even know if we'll make it." So that's kind of the opening scene. So in verse 11, widows and orphans were the most vulnerable people in society. In some respects, they are that way too. But laws were set in place to protect widows from extortion and mistreatment. Now, the book of Deuteronomy outlines those principles. And Naomi felt the weight of providing for her two daughters-in-law, and her security was lost. She had no money. She had no resources. The men couldn't plow the fields to make food, so she was on her own. Furthermore, Naomi rebuked Orpah and Ruth for their desire to stay with her, and it didn't make sense. On one hand, if they went with Naomi, would they be accepted by the people in Bethlehem? And would the daughters-in-law be beyond childbearing years by the time Naomi found a new husband? Naomi knew the best option for the girls was to return home and find husbands. So Orpah and Ruth could have considered the Israelite custom. There's a custom of marriage called a Levirate marriage. Levirate marriage involved a close family member, such as a brother-in-law, marrying his brother's widow to preserve the family through progeny. So the oldest brother-in-law had the obligation to marry his brother's widow, and as such inherited all of the dead brother's estate. And the importance of levirate marriage was the perpetuation of the deceased name in Israel. So you go to the next family member, the next of kin, and they assume all that property and marry the sister or marry the wife of your brother. So that's interesting how that worked, but it was a way that came up to keep the widows from being in poverty. So is that yeah. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So it's a biblical principle that was laid down back in that day. So we can see evidence of that today. So only two stipulations had to be met in order for this type of marriage to work. First, the levirate marriage was obligatory only if it fell to, let's see, only if it, how's this worded out here? I'm not quite sure. Only if the one it fell to was alive when his brother died. So there had to be a living brother. So, or brothers. Sometimes someone who was born under his brother's death did not hold this obligation. So if there was a younger son that was born in a different generation, he wasn't obligated to carry this mandatory forward. But if there was a man and he had brothers and these brothers were alive, the next of kin was obligated for that. So that had to be met first. Secondly, both of the brothers had to be born of the same father. So if you have a different daddy, it didn't work. But many families had 6, 8, 10 kids, so it was a chance that condition would probably be met. If either one of these two stipulations were met, the widow was free to marry any one of her choosing. Naomi gives no evidence of pursuing this for her daughters or for her daughter-in-laws. More than likely, she did not think of this since the two girls were Moabite women. So Naomi's in an awkward situation, with these two foreign girls. Naomi revealed her true feelings. She was bitter in her heart, and she was concerned about their welfare. Those were her true feelings. She loved the girls as her own daughters, but logically speaking, it made no sense for them to stay with her. They had their whole lives ahead of them. And really, you want the best. If you have a kind heart toward people, no matter who they are, you wish the best for them. That's just the way that God-honoring people are. So she did wish for the best of them. They needed to remarry, and in Naomi's mind, the best place for them to do that was for them to turn back and go back into town. So Naomi's concluding statement expressed the pain of her loss. She said, "No, my daughters, my life is too much bitter for you to share, because the Lord's hand had turned against me." Now let's think back to Old Testament times, and people had some disabilities and were blind. Some had conditions that they were outcasts. What was the general rule of thinking back in that day? That people's sin might have caused the problems that they're in, right? That's right. So, and Jesus comes along, and he's asked the same question. The Jewish leaders came to him and said, "This young boy is born blind. Did his parents do something to cause that?" Jesus said, "No, that's not the cause. Sometimes things just happen, but God doesn't punish people on the spot for sinning. Sometimes our consequences cause that, but Jesus set the record straight with that type of thing." So Naomi's losses embitter her soul, and later, as they entered Bethlehem, Naomi expressed bitterness by calling herself, she gave herself a nickname, Mara, and it meant bitterness. "For the Lord has made me very bitter." She continued, "And I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty." That's kind of like saying, well, I was a good person when I met God, but he beat it out of me and now I'm empty. That was kind of general thinking that she had. So loss can embitter our own hearts and cloud the realities of God's care and provisions. Naomi soon discovered that God had not abandoned her, but provided for her a greater expression of his faithfulness. So when something really, really bad happens, something really, really big is about to back that up. That's how God works. He puts us in such a situation that we have no choice other than to rely on him. But it's because something big is going to happen. So our idea of the world is turning into such a bad place. Yes, it is getting bad, but the Lord's about to do something very big to correct all this. So that's kind of the thinking that we need to set within our hearts. In verses 14 through 15, Orpah takes the reasonable route. She kissed her mother-in-law, left for home, and nothing more was said of her. We don't know what happened to her, whether she remarried and had a family, but she's out of the scene. There was no hesitation with Ruth. Ruth is a little different. The text here uses the word she actually clung to her mother-in-law and to describe her decision to stay with Naomi. In Genesis 2, way back to the beginning again, Genesis 2, verse 24, uses the same word as it describes how a man leaves his father and becomes bonds with his wife. So marriage is put into play in the Garden of Eden, and God said it wasn't good for man to be alone, so he is to cling to his wife, and that's how generations followed after that, leaving their original family and starting over. So we see that pattern again with God. Ruth bonded to Naomi and entered her uncertain future. She felt deeply the loss of her husband also, but she also kept Naomi's heart in consideration as well. She felt bad for her mother-in-law. She knew the situation that she would be in. So the two of them decided to stick together, and she would not allow Naomi to suffer alone. Sacrificial love enters the bitterness and pain of another without prejudice. And really, that sentence, the last couple ending sentences, not allowing someone to suffer alone, realizing the loss of the other person, that's called compassion. And that's not something we're normally born with. That compassion comes through a life and a relationship with God. That compassion develops because of who he is and what he does for us and what we carry from that point forward towards other people. So compassion is something that is a fruit of the Spirit and comes through God. So why does loss with some people closer, why does loss draw some people closer to God while others struggle with anger toward God? So something tragic happens. There's a sect of people that cling to God and some others don't. Why do some draw closer to God through tragedy? Because of their relationship, okay. And yet, loss leads grounded people to seek God, doesn't it? It seeks comfort in God. So I go back to what I said earlier. Here comes that cycle again. Faith, help, and fear. We talked about this in the beginning. 3 key words. Number one, begin with what is our level of faith? If we believe that God is in control and he's going to take care of us, that's a huge part of a very important formula. So faith, our level of faith tells where we find our help. And so when we're at such a great loss, where do we go seek that help from? Other people, maybe stuff, that forms addiction. But if we go towards God, that helps us navigate fear and how we handle it. So it's very important. Faith and help and fear, it's something that we need to really think about. Right. It's their well, the Spirit of God draws us. It depends on the condition of our heart. It always has through Scripture. God's people in Israel had hardened hearts. They were an independent people. They were doing to buy favor from God. If we do all these things right, God will honor us. And that's the way it was until Christ came. But under the new covenant, we don't earn anything. It's not a merit-based system. But what's our level of faith to begin with? A lot of people have open hearts. The Gentiles had open hearts. They didn't know such a law like the Israelites. So they quickly came to God through not having a formal way of life. So loss leads grounded people to seek comfort. That's just how it is. Anger is a common emotional response to grief. So when loss occurs, anger happens. I noticed there was a handful of people at the fire running around looking, what was the cause? Who caused this? What happened? And it was lightning. That was an act of God, And right then it wasn't known because there was a thunderstorm for about 20 minutes, but it moved on. But the damage that it caused stayed there and caused all that devastation. But there were actually people looking to blame something for that fire, angry people. And so that if we're not careful, we can develop that in our heart. But if we know that, well, God's up to something, I think it was John Wesley, that was a pastor. That's where the Methodist Church came from. During a sermon that he was preaching in church, the deacons ran in and said, "Your house is on fire." And Wesley kept preaching and said, "Well, God provided that house. He'll provide another one." He had that in his heart that God will take care no matter what happens. So it's a lesson for us. Christians need to learn that God has our back no matter what happens. That's a big thing. Yes. Yes. That's right. That's right. Well, lightning is thrown from his fingertips. Lightning, I mean, God creates that force, it emanates throughout his, that's now the problem that it causes, is a different story, but God owns the lightning and the hail and the snow and everything. He expresses himself through those type of elements. So yeah, he sent the lightning. Yes, I do. Because in the world we live in, how else is he going to get our attention? We're so wrapped up in all this stuff. He says, "Hey, I'm going to take your home, or I'm here. Can you hear me?" And so not that he's doing bad. He's just trying to get people to come close to him, to draw people. And this whole world, every corner of the earth is experiencing something. It doesn't matter where you live. God's trying to get people's attention before Christ comes back. That's the issue. And so he's doing very strange things to get people's attention. So what do they do when they're running out of a burning building? They're running towards chaplains that are feeding them and talking to them, people that can offer help. So his soldiers are on the ground. So that's a bigger picture view of what really is going on. So it's sad that humanity has to operate in such a way. Everything could have been good if we just obeyed him from the beginning, lived in the land of paradise, but we didn't want it that way. So interesting. All right. Well, we go through the next part, which is a smaller part here, loyalty. And I'll summarize this part because we kind of already talked about Ruth decides she's going to stay with her mother-in-law. She shows loyalty to her family roots. And it talks about a type of love. Ruth's words to her mother-in-law saying, "I'm going to be with you," she captures the beauty of really true love, which is the love of God, agape love. And so right in the middle of that paragraph, she begged Naomi to accept her decision to remain with her. She's like, "I don't care what you think about me. I really don't care what's behind or in front of me. I'm going to stick with you no matter what. I love you." And that's the way she wanted to go forward. That's right. That's right. That's right. I am the Lord's. Yes, I am beloved, and the Lord loves me, and my beloved. So Ruth replied, "Do not plead with me to abandon you or return and not follow you, for wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you live, I will live, and your people will be my people, and your God will be my God." I don't even know him yet, but whoever he is, I'll worship him with you. So really, that's a basic Gentile frame of thinking. I'm just going to worship this God I've heard about. He's gotten my attention. He's drawing me this way, and so I'm going to worship him. So it's a beautiful story, very much about innocence. Ruth's unselfish loyalty had been quoted and praised and shared throughout many generations. Morning. Um, every time Jewish people celebrate the Sabbath on Friday night, after the prayers and after the songs and celebration, there's a time to honor the family. The husband sings Proverbs 31 to his wife. She is held in high esteem. And if you know Psalms 31, you know how beautiful a woman's character is highlighted in that chapter. They next sing to the kids, "May you be like Ruth and Esther and carry on the family traditions." So that's back from those days, honoring their family roots. How does loyalty play a part in our relationships with God and others? And loyalty reflects our commitment level and our faithfulness. If we're loyal to something, we're committed to that, and we are faithful to the cause. It involves placing God's will above our own, if we're committed, and it's echoing God's own faithfulness. God is faithful to us. We didn't ask him to continue to be our friend after we sinned so much, and he has chosen to be with us no matter what. So that is something that we need to think about. So what value does society place on loyalty? What about today? Where's loyalty on that scale today? It doesn't exist. There's no loyalty today. So the world has lost loyalty and the true meaning behind it. But God is very much a different person with loyalty. So, and you don't need to carry a loyalty card. That's the big thing. How can loyalty be a way to view God's provision and protection? Simply by trusting the Lord to provide and protect, so you will not want and not fear. That's part of a psalm we're very familiar with. I shall want nothing. I shall lack nothing. I already have it through God. He'll provide. So, again, it goes back to our beginning statement, which I said earlier, and it talks about our faith, what level of faith we have. And when we consider our level of faith, where do we run to for help because of that faith? Or do we run any place for help? And that kind of help tells us how we're going to deal with fear. So faith, help, and fear. This goes all through this chapter. Interesting. Okay. So provision. We see here that Ruth gets back with Naomi to Bethlehem, and they are trying to find food, as you can imagine. And there's a guy named Boaz who is a part of Naomi's original family, a brother. Her husband was in this brother's family. And so they arrive into town. And if you know a little bit about the book of Deuteronomy, way back then, farmers, and still today, if Jeff Schwartz were here, he would tell you the same thing. When you have a big acreage farm, you leave the outsides so people can pick grain or pick up corn cobs for their animals. It's still done today. And so Ruth goes to the outer layer of this field and starts to pick grain so she can make bread for Naomi, her brother-in-law. Boaz asked his servant, who was in charge of the harvesters, who this young woman was that he saw out in the field. And the servant answered, "She is the young Moabite woman returned with Naomi from the territory of Moab." And she asked, "Will you let me pick grain fallen among the bundles behind the harvesters?" So the farmers are out gathering harvest, but they're leaving big pieces of grain behind on purpose. It was commanded by the law at that time to help poor people. So she came and has been on her feet since early morning, except that she rested a little in shelter. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Listen, my daughter, do not go gather grain in another field. Do not leave this one, but stay close here to my family." What would have happened to Ruth if she had gone into another field? Probably taken advantage of by other people that didn't know her. So Boaz was aware of her being there. He was kind enough to let her stay in the field and keep picking, but he wanted to keep his eye on her. And that was a quality of Boaz that he had. He had compassion on foreigners. So she fell face down, bowed to the ground, and asked him, Why have I found favor with you so that you notice me? I'm basically a foreigner. Why are you being so kind to me? And Boaz answered her, everything you have done for your mother-in-law I know about. You brought her back to her homeland, you've stuck by her, and I'm going to reward you for your kindness. You're welcome to stay here. So that was the basic message that she had. So, and Boaz said, may the Lord reward you for what you have done, and may you receive full reward from the Lord God of Israel, whose wings that you're now under and have come for refuge. So what a touching story. It was mandatory Jewish law to take care of people that were poor. And so Ruth falls into this situation, and she's blessed by it. So Boaz approaches her, and we're going to find out next week how he grafts Ruth into the family. And Ruth is in our genealogy of the family of God leading to Christ. Ruth is the great-grandmother of David. And so that right down the family line that on our ways to the days of Christ. So interesting story. We're going to pierce this next week and get into a little bit more. But the moral of this story today is that believers are going to suffer loss. Today, there are times of tragedy. Things will happen, bad things are happening, but the underlying fact is that we need to allow others to minister to us, and we need to allow ministry to others through these tragedies. And believers can be confident in God's sovereignty and ability to work in situations. So we've seen this firsthand right here in Tampa this week of God's compassion and sending people down, much like our story today. So any comments or questions as we close? Okay, let's have a word of prayer, and we will close our Bible study. Good introduction. Heavenly Father, we thank you for our time of Bible study here today, highlighting the principle behind our faith. May us remember that when tragedy strikes, that God is always by our side in the middle of that fight or leading us to a better day. So may we rest our faith and know that He'll help us, and that will help us deal with our fears that we face today. For it's in Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right, we will go to the worship service here in just a few minutes at the top of the hour.